I sat at my daughter's dinner table after spending the entire evening cooking to serve her family. She set her glass down, looked right into my eyes, and said coldly, "Mom, don't expect me to take care of you when you're old. I have my own life." My son-in-law didn't even bother looking up from his phone. I nodded, washed my dish, went home, and locked the door behind me. But less than 12 hours later, a phone call rang out, and just seconds after picking up, the arrogance on their faces vanished completely. If you found your way here today, I believe it was for a reason. Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you? What city? What country? Let's see how far Silent Revenge with Auntie May reaches. This story contains fictional elements added for depth and meaning. Any similarity to names or places is coincidental, but what this story teaches you is worth holding on to. I still remember exactly what I was doing when my life changed forever. I was sitting at my daughter's kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in early October, eating a pot roast I had cooked at my own house, packed into a casserole dish, and carried across town because Vanessa mentioned that morning she was too tired to cook. The kids were chasing each other down the hallway. Lily, 9 years old, was shrieking with laughter. Noah, 6, was right behind her, his socks sliding on the hardwood floor. It looked like any ordinary evening. Marcus sat at the head of the table, scrolling through his phone with one hand and forking food into his mouth with the other. He had not looked up once since I arrived. I watched my daughter refill her glass of water and thought about how long I had been doing this. Driving over, cooking, dropping off, picking up, showing up whenever the phone rang. 6 years. Ever since my husband Gerald passed and left me with a quiet house and 2 hands that didn't know how to stop working. I didn't mind. That's what I told myself. I didn't mind at all. Then I opened my mouth and asked the most ordinary question in the world. "Vanessa," I said, keeping my voice light, "I was just thinking, if I slow down in a few years when I'm older, do you think I could count on you a little, just now and then?" Vanessa set her glass down on the table. She turned and looked straight at me, and what I saw in her face made my chest tighten. Not surprise, not discomfort, just a kind of flat, matter-of-fact certainty, like I had asked something slightly ridiculous. "Mom," she said, "don't expect me to take care of you when you're old. I have my own life and my own family." The fork in my hand felt suddenly very heavy. I looked at Marcus. He had not put his phone down. He had not looked up. He turned a piece of potato over with his fork and kept eating like I had said nothing at all, like the air in the room had not just changed completely. My ears were ringing. "I understand," I said, and that was the end of it. Lily ran back into the kitchen, demanding dessert. Noah knocked over his juice. The evening continued exactly as it had begun. I washed the casserole dish before I left. I drove home in the dark with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. The streets of our little Ohio town rolled past the windows, the pharmacy, the church, the elementary school where I had worked for 11 years. I had lived here my whole adult life. I knew every turn by heart. But that night, for the first time, nothing looked quite familiar. I did not cry. My eyes burned, but the tears didn't come. I just drove and breathed and told myself maybe she was tired, maybe she had a hard day, maybe she didn't mean it the way it sounded. But then I thought about Marcus, his eyes never leaving that phone, his fork moving slowly, steadily, not one word, not one glance. He heard every syllable, and he chose to keep eating. I got home, locked the front door, and stood in my kitchen for a long time without turning on the lights. The next morning, I was up at 5 o'clock, the way I always am, the coffee maker gurgling on the counter, the house still dark and quiet around me. I moved on, habit poured my mug, opened the refrigerator for the creamer. And then I stopped. There was a calendar stuck to the fridge door with a sunflower magnet Gerald had bought me years ago at a county fair. I had written on it in blue ink, neat and careful the way I write everything. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, pick up Lily at 3:10. Pick up Noah at 3:25. Tuesday, groceries for Vanessa. Check if they need anything else. Saturday, watch the kids. Marcus and Vanessa have errands. I stood there reading it with my coffee going cold in my hand. Every single day on that calendar belonged to someone else. My hands started to tremble, not from cold, not from age, but from something rising up inside my chest that I had been pressing down for a very long time. My throat tightened. My eyes burned again, and this time the tears came just 2 or 3, sliding down before I could stop them. I pressed my fingers against my lips and breathed hard through my nose. 6 years. 6 years of that calendar. 6 years of my handwriting filling in everyone else's needs. 6 years since Gerald died and I had quietly, without anyone asking, turned my entire life into a service. I set my mug on the counter. I opened the kitchen drawer and took out a pen. I stood in front of that calendar for a long moment, my heart hammering my hand, gripping the pen so hard my knuckles ached. I didn't cross out my daughter's name. I crossed out every single task that no one had ever asked me if I wanted to do. Then I put the pen down, finished my cold coffee standing at the counter, and got ready for work. I didn't know yet what any of it was going to cost me. By the time I pulled into the school parking lot that Wednesday morning, the sun was barely up, hanging low and pale behind a sheet of gray October clouds. I tied my apron strings in the locker room, pressed my palms flat against the cold metal door for just a moment, and told myself to breathe. The cafeteria was already warm and smelled like oatmeal and dish soap. That smell had been the backdrop of my mornings for 11 years, and usually it steadied me. That morning, it just reminded me that I had somewhere to be, something to do, and that was enough to keep moving. Clara was already at her station behind the bakery counter, slicing a tray of banana bread with the calm, practiced efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times. Clara Bennett had worked 3 stations down from me for over 20 years. She was 64 years old, broad-shouldered, with silver hair she kept in a tight bun, and a way of looking at you that made it very hard to lie. She glanced up the moment I walked in. "You look like you didn't sleep," she said. Not unkindly, just factually the way Clara said most things. "I slept fine," I said. "Evelyn." I set down my bag. "I slept a little." She put the knife down and turned to face me fully. "Tell me." So I told her. Standing there in the warm kitchen with the oatmeal bubbling on the stove, I told her about the pot roast, about the question I had asked about Vanessa's face, that flat, certain look, and about Marcus, who had never once lifted his eyes from his phone. Clara's expression did not change while I spoke. She just listened, arms crossed, jaw set. When I finished, she was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. 6 days a week, Evelyn," she said. 5 days here, and every Saturday you drive across town for them. 3 of those 6 days nobody pays you a single dollar." "That's just family," I said. My voice came out smaller than I intended. Clara picked up her knife again. "I covered your shift 4 times this year. 4 times because Vanessa called last minute, and you dropped everything and ran." She looked at me sideways. "Did you know that?" My stomach dropped. "Clara, I didn't realize you had to. I'm not telling you to make you feel bad. I'm telling you so you understand what you've been carrying." She pointed the knife gently toward me. "It's not small, Evelyn. What you've been doing is not small." I wanted to argue. I pressed my lips together and started portioning oatmeal instead. The morning rush came and swallowed everything. 200 children filing through with their trays, their noise, their small catastrophes. A spilled juice here. A forgotten lunch number there. I smiled and ladled and said good morning until my cheeks ached. It was only when the last child left and the cafeteria went quiet that I felt it again. That hollow, bruised feeling sitting right in the center of my chest. I drove home after my shift with the windows cracked, the cold October air sharp against my face. I was still in my uniform when I walked through. My front door still had my name tag on when I sat down at the kitchen table. I had been sitting there maybe 4 minutes when my phone rang. Vanessa. My finger hovered over the screen. I thought about the casserole dish, the pot roast, the calendar. I picked up. "Mom." Her voice was completely normal, bright even, like Tuesday evening had been erased. "Lily's out of school. Where are you?" My throat tightened. "I'm home, Vanessa." "Well, you have to go pick her up. She's been waiting." Something shifted in my chest, not anger exactly, more like a door swinging open that had been stuck shut for years. "You didn't ask me," I said. A short pause. "What?" "You didn't ask me, Vanessa. You just assumed." "Mom, what are you talking about? You always pick her up. That's just what you do." "That's true," I said, and my voice was steadier than I felt. "But starting today, if you need my help, you ask me first. You don't assume. Are you seriously doing this right now?" Her voice climbed half an octave. "Are you punishing me for what I said last night?" "No." I looked out the kitchen window at the oak tree in my backyard, its leaves gone deep red overnight. "You told me you have your own life and your own family to take care of. I'm respecting that." "Mom, you'll need to make other arrangements for this afternoon. I'm sorry, Vanessa." She made a sharp sound, half frustration, half disbelief, and the call ended. I set the phone face down on the table. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. My hands were pressed flat on the tabletop, and I noticed they were trembling not violently, just a fine, steady shaking, like a plucked string slowly going still. In 63 years, I had never once said those words to my daughter. "You didn't ask me." 4 words, and they had cost me everything I had. I was still sitting there 10 minutes later when the phone rang again. I turned it over and looked at the screen. It wasn't Vanessa, it was Marcus. I almost let it ring through to voicemail. My thumb hovered over the screen, and for 3 full seconds I just stared at his name. Then I picked up. "Mom." Marcus's voice was warm. Gentle, even nothing like the man who had spent an entire dinner staring at his phone, while his wife told me not to expect anything from her in my old age. "I just wanted to check on you. Vanessa told me you two had a rough call this afternoon." I shifted the phone to my other ear. "We did. She didn't mean to upset you. You know how she gets when she's overwhelmed. She works those long shifts. The kids are a handful. Sometimes things come out wrong." He exhaled slowly like a man trying very hard to sound reasonable. "She loves you. We both do." "She looked me in the eye, Marcus," I said. It wasn't something that slipped out. A short pause. "I hear you. I do. But I want you to know I always tell her she needs to appreciate you more. I tell her all the time that you've already done so much for us, more than most mothers would." His voice dropped half a notch, warm and confidential. "You're the backbone of this family, Mom. I hope you know that." My chest loosened just slightly, just enough. "Thank you," I said. "That means something. Get some rest tonight. Things will look better in the morning." I thanked him again and hung up. I sat in my kitchen in the dark for a long moment. At least Marcus understands, I told myself. At least one of them sees it. But even as I thought it, something very small and very quiet sat at the back of my mind, the way he had said backbone of this family, smooth and practiced like a line he had used before. I pushed the thought away. I was too tired to follow it anywhere. I went to bed that night, still hurting, but not quite as hollow as before. I slept better than I expected. The next morning, I went through my shift, the way I always do. Oatmeal fruit cups, the breakfast line, the noise, the small faces. Clara and I worked side by side without talking much. She knew I needed the quiet, and she gave it to me the way only a 20-year friend can without making a production of it. After my shift, I stopped at Henderson's, the grocery store, 2 blocks from the school, the one I had been shopping at for 30 years. I needed coffee and eggs and nothing else. I told myself I was just running a quick errand. I was reaching for a bag of ground coffee on the middle shelf when I heard my name. "Mrs. Hartwell." I turned around. The young woman standing behind me was maybe mid-30s with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She was in street clothes, a grocery basket on her arm off shift by the look of it, but I recognized the Millbrook store lanyard clipped to her jacket zipper. She was carrying a handbasket with yogurt and a magazine, and she was looking at me with the slightly cautious expression of someone who wasn't sure if she was about to step into something. "You're Vanessa's mom, right?" she said. "I'm Rachel Dorsey. I work with her over at the Millbrook store. We've been on the same shift for almost 3 years." "Of course," I said, shaking her hand. "Vanessa's mentioned you." Rachel smiled, then tilted her head. Is everything okay between you two? She seemed really tense yesterday, kept checking her phone. We're working through some things, I said. Oh. Rachel shifted her basket to her other hand. Vanessa was venting about it during our lunch break yesterday. She wasn't trying to gossip. I think she just needed to say it out loud to someone. Is it because of the babysitter situation? Marcus was pretty wound up about that cost. I felt something go very still inside me. I'm sorry, I said carefully. Rachel blinked. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. The childcare cost, this week since you weren't available. She shifted her basket from one hand to the other. Vanessa mentioned Marcus was frustrated about having to pay someone. I just assumed you already knew that part. I didn't, I said. My voice came out even, calm, like I was discussing the weather. Rachel's face fell. Oh no, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have assumed. I just thought, it's all right. I kept my voice steady even though my pulse had started drumming in my ears. Can I ask you something, Rachel? What exactly did Vanessa say about why Marcus was upset? Rachel hesitated. She pressed her lips together, clearly debating with herself. Then she looked at me with the expression of someone who had decided that honesty at this point was the kinder option. She said Marcus is usually the one who tells her to call you when they need something. Because Rachel paused, choosing the words carefully. Because you live alone. And he figures that means asking you is no big deal. The bag of coffee was still in my hand. I became aware of the fluorescent lights humming above us, the tinny music playing from the store speakers, a child crying 2 aisles over. Everything very ordinary, everything exactly the same as it had been 60 seconds ago. The man who called me last night, the man who said I was the backbone of this family, who told me I had already done so much, was the same man who had been sending his wife to my door for years because he decided that a woman living alone had nothing better to do. Thank you, Rachel, I said. I put the coffee back on the shelf. Rachel touched my arm lightly. Mrs. Hartwell, I really am sorry. I thought you knew. Please don't apologize, I said. You didn't do anything wrong. I walked to the end of the aisle and kept walking straight through the automatic doors and out into the cold afternoon air. I stood in the parking lot with my hands at my sides and my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my back teeth. I had no groceries. I had gone in for coffee and eggs, and I had come out with nothing but the truth. I drove home on autopilot, every traffic light, every turn registering somewhere distant and automatic. When I pulled into my driveway and cut the engine, I sat for a moment with my hands still on the wheel. Then I looked up. Vanessa was standing at my front door, arms crossed, waiting. I got out of the car slowly. Vanessa didn't move from the front step. She had her arms crossed tight over her chest. Her jaw set, her eyes fixed on me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face since she was a teenager and thought I had embarrassed her in front of her friends. She was still wearing her supermarket uniform. She must have come straight from her shift. Did Rachel say something to you? She asked, before I had even closed the car door. She mentioned Marcus was upset about the childcare cost, I said, keeping my voice level. She thought I already knew. Of course she did. Vanessa pressed her fingers to her forehead, jaw tightening. Can we please go inside? I don't want to do this in the driveway. I unlocked the front door and held it open. She walked past me without a word. In the living room, she dropped onto the couch and leaned forward with her elbows on her knees, rubbing her hands together like she was trying to warm them up. I sat in Gerald's old armchair across from her and waited. Marcus is the problem, she said finally. Her voice came out sharp and certain. He's always been the one pushing me to ask you for things. You live alone, he says. She doesn't mind, he says. Just call her. She looked up at me, eyes bright with something between anger and desperation. I know how that sounds, but it's the truth, Mom. He's been doing this for years. I looked at my daughter, at the way she held herself rigid defensive like a woman bracing for impact. Was it all Marcus? I asked. Yes. No hesitation. Everything, every single time over 6 years. Something flickered behind her eyes. A small, fast thing there and gone. Before she could answer, her phone buzzed on the cushion beside her. She glanced at the screen and something shifted in her face, irritation maybe, or guilt. She reached for it, clearly intending to silence it. But her fingers were shaking from the tension of the last 10 minutes, and instead of sending the call to voicemail, she fumbled and hit the speakerphone button. Rachel's voice filled the room immediately. "Vanessa. Hey, I just wanted to call and apologize if I made things weird with your mom at the store. I honestly thought she already knew about—" "Rachel, it's fine." Vanessa grabbed for the phone, her face going red. "I just want to say, and I know this isn't my place, but don't put all of this on Marcus." Vanessa froze. Her hand hovered over the phone. "You were the one saying Mom will come if I call way before Noah was even born. Remember when Lily was barely walking? You told me you'd never have to stress about childcare because your mom was always available. That was you, Vanessa. That was your words." Vanessa ended the call. The room went so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. Vanessa sat with her phone face down in her lap, her shoulders pulled up around her ears, her chest rising and falling too fast. A muscle twitched along her jaw. Her eyes were fixed on a point somewhere on the carpet between us, and I could see her blinking rapidly the way she used to when she was small and trying very hard not to cry in public. "So it was both of you," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The words landed exactly as heavily as they were meant to. Vanessa's chin trembled. She pressed her lips together hard, fighting it, but her eyes filled anyway. 2 bright tears spilling over before she could stop them. She wiped them away fast and rough with the back of her hand, almost angrily, like she resented them for showing up. "I was going to blame him for all of it," she said. Her voice came out cracked down the middle. "I had it all planned out in my head on the drive over. Marcus pushed me. Marcus convinced me. Marcus made it seem normal." She laughed once short and humorless, and pressed her knuckles against her mouth. And then Rachel had to go and say that. "She was telling the truth," I said. "I know she was." Vanessa looked up at me then, and the defensiveness had cracked open just enough to show something raw underneath. "I know, Mom. Okay, I know it wasn't just him." My heart squeezed painfully, not with anger, not anymore, with something much older and much sadder than anger. This was my daughter. The same little girl who used to fall asleep in the car and go completely limp in my arms when I carried her inside. And somewhere between then and now, we had both built something neither of us had meant to build. "I think," I said carefully, "that we both need some time to think." Vanessa nodded. She stood up, smoothing her uniform with both hands, steadying herself the way people do when they don't want anyone to see how unsteady they actually are. At the front door, she paused with her hand on the frame. "Mom." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry. Not for what you want me to be sorry for yet, but I'm getting there." The door clicked shut behind her. I sat in Gerald's chair for a long time after that, my hands folded in my lap, the autumn dark gathering outside the windows. My chest ached with the particular weight of a truth that has finally been said out loud, not light, not relieving, just real. The next morning, before I'd even put the coffee on my phone, rang. Clara. "Come in early," she said without saying hello. "I need to tell you something, and Evelyn, you're not going to want to hear it." Clara was waiting for me at the corner table by the window when I arrived, the small one that overlooks the schoolyard, the one we usually only use on slow days when the lunch rush is over, and there is finally room to breathe. She had 2 cups of coffee already poured. She had pulled both chairs so they faced each other directly, not side by side the way we usually sat. That alone told me this was going to be serious. "Sit down," she said. I sat. I wrapped both hands around the mug and waited. "Tell me everything first," Clara said. "From yesterday, all of it." So I did. I told her about Vanessa on the front step, about Rachel's voice coming through the speakerphone, about those 2 fast, angry tears Vanessa wiped away like she was furious at herself for having them. I told her what Vanessa said at the door, "Not for what you want me to be sorry for yet." I told her I had sat in Gerald's chair until the room went dark. Clara listened without moving. When I finished, she turned her coffee mug a full, slow rotation in her hands, the way she does when she is choosing her next words carefully. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "And I need you to actually answer it, not just say yes to make me feel better." "Go ahead." "Do you remember the winter, right after Vanessa and Marcus moved into their first apartment? Lily was maybe 4 months old." I remembered it clearly. That apartment had a broken radiator and drafty windows, and Vanessa had called me crying on a Tuesday night because the heating bill was more than she expected, and she did not know how they were going to cover it. "I remember," I said. "What did you do?" "I covered the bill." Clara nodded. "And when her car broke down that March, I lent her mine, took the bus to work for 2 weeks. And when she went back to work after her maternity leave and couldn't find anyone to watch Lily on short notice, my hands tightened around the mug. I told her I would do it. And when Noah was born and Marcus picked up extra delivery routes and Vanessa's schedule changed and suddenly she needed someone 3 days a week instead of 2, I adjusted. Did she ask you to... I opened my mouth, closed it. Clara leaned forward slightly. "Evelyn, did she ask you, or did you just see the problem and step in before she had a chance to figure it out herself?" The schoolyard outside the window was empty, and gray wet leaves pressed flat against the pavement. A single swing moved in the wind back and forth, nobody on it. "I stepped in," I said. The words felt strange in my mouth, heavy in a way I hadn't expected. "I switched shifts for you 4 times this year," Clara said. "I have rearranged my own schedule more times than I want to count this year because Vanessa called last minute and you never once said no." She held up one hand before I could speak. "I am not telling you that to make you feel guilty. I am telling you because you are one of my oldest friends and I have watched you disappear piece by piece into that family's needs for 6 years. And I think you deserve to understand the whole picture." "I was just trying to help her," I said. My voice came out smaller than I intended, cracked at the edges. My eyes burned. "I know you were." Clara's voice softened just slightly the way it does when she means something deeply. "But Evelyn, there is a difference between helping someone and never letting them fall. Every single time Vanessa hit a wall, you knocked it down for her before she ever had to figure out how to climb it." She paused. "What do you think she learned from that?" The burn behind my eyes spread into my throat. I pressed my lips together hard and stared at the empty swing outside, still moving, still moving. "She learned that I would always be there," I said. "She learned more than that." Clara wrapped both hands around her own mug. "She learned that being stuck is temporary because Mom fixes it. She learned that consequences don't really land because Mom absorbs them. She learned, and this is the part that's going to sting Evelyn, so brace yourself. She learned that your time and your energy don't have a real cost, because you never once let her feel the cost." A tear slid down my cheek before I could catch it, then another. I didn't wipe them away. I just sat there with my coffee going cold and let Clara's words settle into me the way cold water settles into dry ground slowly, completely, with nowhere left to run. "I taught her," I said. It wasn't a question. "You both built it," Clara said. "Her taking, you giving. Neither of you ever stopped to look at what you were building together." The bell rang somewhere down the hall. The morning rush was starting. We both stood up automatically the way you do after 30 years of shift work. Your body moves before your brain catches up. I tied my apron with fingers that weren't quite steady. Clara touched my arm once briefly the way she does instead of hugging. "You're not a bad mother," she said firmly. "Don't you dare walk away from this table thinking that." "Then what am I?" I asked. Clara picked up her coffee and looked at me with 20 years of friendship behind her eyes. "You're a woman who loved her daughter so much, she forgot to leave room for her daughter to grow up." I carried that sentence through the entire morning rush, through 200 bowls of oatmeal and 400 cartons of milk, and every small, bright face that came through my line. I smiled at all of them. My hands moved. My mouth said, "Good morning, and here you go and have a good day." But somewhere underneath all of it, something that had been wound very tight for a very long time was slowly, quietly beginning to loosen. That weekend, my phone rang on a Saturday afternoon. I looked at the screen and felt my breath catch just slightly, just for a second. It was Lily, my 9-year-old granddaughter, calling me herself without anyone telling her to. I picked up on the first ring. "Grandma." Lily's voice was bright and slightly breathless, the way it always is when she has just thought of something and cannot wait to say it. "Do you want to get ice cream with me? Just us. Mom said I could call you." My chest did something complicated, tightened and loosened at the same time. "I would love that," I said. "Give me 20 minutes. I called Vanessa to arrange the pickup. She answered on the second ring, her voice careful and neutral, like someone walking on ice and testing each step. "Lily wants ice cream," I said. "I'd like to take her. Just the two of us." A pause. "Okay." Then quieter. "Mom, I'm glad she called you." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just said I would be there soon and hung up. The ice cream shop on Clemson Street had been there since before Lily was born, a narrow little place with a hand-painted sign and 6 stools at the counter, and a chalkboard menu that changed every week. Gerald and I used to bring Vanessa there on Sunday afternoons when she was small. The owner still recognized me. He gave Lily an extra scoop without being asked. We sat at the window table. Lily had chocolate with rainbow sprinkles. I had a small coffee because 63-year-old knees do not need sugar at 3 in the afternoon, and Lily thought that was very funny. "Grandma, you always get coffee," she said, swinging her feet under the stool, "even at ice cream places." "Coffee is reliable," I said. "Ice cream melts." She giggled and went back to her scoop, and for a few minutes we just sat there in the warm afternoon light while she told me about her friend Emma, who had gotten a hamster and named it Captain, and about her teacher who had assigned a project on Ohio history, and about how Noah had cried at school on Wednesday, but wouldn't tell anyone why. I listened. Really listened, not with half my attention on what I needed to cook for dinner, or whether I had remembered to text Vanessa back. Just listened the way I used to before listening became something I only had energy for in the spaces between everything else. Then Lily looked up at me with those serious brown eyes she had inherited from Gerald and said, "Grandma, are you mad at Mom?" "No, sweetheart," I said. "Why do you ask?" "Because you haven't been coming over." She licked a drip of chocolate off the side of her cone with great concentration. "You used to come all the time. Now you don't." "I still see you," I said carefully. "I just have things of my own to take care of sometimes." Lily looked genuinely puzzled. Her eyebrows pulled together, that little furrow she gets, the one that makes her look 40 years old. "You have things to do." I laughed out loud, a real laugh surprised out of me. "Of course I do." "Like what?" "Well, I'm replanting the rose garden. Your grandfather started it years ago and I let it go. I'm fixing that." I counted on my fingers. "I've been walking in the mornings, reading books I've been meaning to read for years, having lunch with Clara." Lily absorbed this information with the solemn focus of someone being told something genuinely new. Then she nodded slowly like she was filing it away. "Mom says you live alone," she said. "So you're always free." The coffee cup was halfway to my lips. I set it back down on the saucer very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands have suddenly stopped being reliable. "Mom says that," I asked. I kept my voice light. "Easy. The way you keep your voice when you are talking to a 9-year-old who has no idea what she just handed you." "Yeah." Lily was already focused back on her cone, rotating it to catch a drip on the other side. "She says when she needs someone to pick us up, she just calls you because you're not doing anything, because it's just you at your house. Just you at your house." I looked out the window at Clemson Street. A woman about my age was walking a golden retriever on a red leash. 2 teenage boys were on bicycles. A man in a canvas jacket was raking leaves into a pile at the edge of his yard, humming something I could almost hear through the glass. All of them doing ordinary things. all of them with ordinary lives that belonged entirely to themselves. No husband, grown child, therefore always free, always available, always without anything important enough to interrupt. That was how my daughter saw my life. I understood sitting there that it was not cruelty. Vanessa had not sat down and decided to think of her mother as an empty vessel. She had simply never been given a reason to think otherwise, because every time she called, I came. Every time she needed, I provided. I had been so consistently available that my availability had stopped registering as a choice and started registering as a condition, like the weather, like the furniture, like something that had simply always been there and always would be. Lily finished her cone and wiped her hands on 2 napkins, very seriously, the way Noah never does. "Grandma," she said, "can we do this again? Just us?" My throat tightened with something warm and aching all at once. "Anytime you want, sweetheart, you just call me." Her face broke into a grin so wide it scrunched her nose, and something in my chest cracked open in the best possible way. I drove her home in the golden late afternoon light, and when Vanessa opened the door, Lily ran past her into the house already calling for Noah. Vanessa looked at me over the threshold. She looked tired, uncertain, like a woman who had been carrying something heavy and wasn't sure whether she was allowed to put it down. "Thank you," she said quietly. I nodded and walked back to my car. That evening I went next door and knocked on Dorothy Keene's door. Dorothy was 71, retired, white-haired, and had more plans on any given weekend than I had managed in the past 3 years combined. She opened the door in a paint-splattered apron and reading glasses pushed up on her head. "Evelyn," she said, delighted. "Perfect timing. I just put the kettle on." "I was wondering," I said, "if you might show me what you do with your time." Dorothy's face split into a grin. She stepped back and held the door wide open. "I thought you'd never ask." 3 weeks passed. I spent them differently than I had spent any 3 weeks in the past 6 years. Dorothy took me to her garden club on Saturday mornings, 12 women around a folding table in the community center on Ridgeline Road, talking about soil pH and frost dates and which varieties of tulip bulb held up best in Ohio winters. I went twice and found to my own genuine surprise that I had opinions, strong ones. Gerald had always been the one with a green thumb in our house. Apparently more had rubbed off on me than I realized all those years of standing beside him in the garden asking questions he was always happy to answer. I started walking before my shifts. Just 20 minutes down Birchwood Avenue and back in the gray pre-dawn quiet, my hands deep in my jacket pockets, my breath making small white clouds in the October cold. It was nothing remarkable by any measure, but it was mine, completely mine, and in those 20 minutes nobody needed anything from me, and I cannot tell you how much I had missed that feeling without knowing I was missing it. Vanessa called twice during those 3 weeks. Both times her voice was careful and measured at the start, like someone testing ice before stepping onto it. Both times she actually asked whether I was available. The first time I said I needed to check my schedule, which was true. The second time I said the same thing, and in the pause that followed, I heard something shift in her voice. Not anger. Something more like recalibration. A person adjusting to new terrain without a map for it yet. Then she called to invite me to Noah's birthday party. "Joanne will be there," she added almost as an afterthought in the way people mention things they are not sure how to frame. I had met Marcus's mother perhaps 4 or 5 times over the years at Christmases, at Noah's first birthday, when he was still small enough to fall asleep in the cake once at a school event where we had stood near each other for 20 minutes and found nothing beyond pleasantries to say. Joanne Mercer was a compact private woman who kept her own counsel. I had no strong feelings about her either way. I said I would come. Noah's birthday fell on a Saturday at the end of October. Vanessa had hung orange and yellow streamers in the living room and built a balloon arch that listed slightly to the left, a detail that would have driven me to straighten it 6 months ago and that I let go of entirely now. The chocolate cake on the kitchen counter had 6 candles and a sugar rocket ship pressed into the frosting, and Noah himself was vibrating at a frequency that suggested he had been awake since approximately 4 in the morning. I brought him a building set he had mentioned back in August, casual and in passing, the kind of mention children make without expecting anyone to remember. He tore the wrapping paper off in under 5 seconds and immediately tried to open the box with his teeth. Some things about that child were entirely his grandfather. Joanne was already at the dining table when I arrived. She looked up and gave me a nod that was neither warm nor cold-measured was the word that came to mind, the nod of a woman who reserves judgment until she has reason to do otherwise. We sat across from each other through most of the party with the noise of children and the good smell of chocolate cake between us, and I found myself watching her more than I had expected to. It was Marcus who changed the afternoon. He had been quiet through most of lunch pleasantly, carefully quiet the way he was when he was thinking about something he intended to say later. Then somewhere between the second slice of cake and the tearing open of gifts, he leaned back in his chair and started talking in the easy, expansive way of a man who believes he is simply making conversation. "Things have been a lot more complicated lately," he said. "Schedules, logistics, everything takes twice as long to sort out." Joanne set her fork down. The sound it made against the plate was small and precise. "Complicated how? Just managing everything, the kids' pickups, the day-to-day." He waved one hand loosely. "Without the support we used to have, it adds up." "You're their father," Joanne said. Marcus smiled that particular smile of his patient, and slightly indulgent the smile of a man who has talked his way through most obstacles and sees no reason this should be different. "Of course, but early mornings, long routes." "Evelyn works early mornings," Joanne said. Her voice had not changed in volume or temperature by a single degree. It was level in the way a surgical instrument is level precise without excess. The smile tightened at the corners of Marcus's mouth. "That's a little different." How one word, flat as a coin, dropped on tile. Marcus opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He reached for his coffee cup instead. Joanne did not look away from her son. She picked up her fork and cut a piece of cake with the focused, economical attention of a woman who has made her point and sees no need to underline it. But she was not finished. She set the fork down a second time. When she spoke again, every adult at that table went still. "I want to ask you something, Marcus. The things you expect Evelyn to do, picking the children up, being available when something comes up, rearranging her day on short notice, why have you never once asked me to do those same things?" The balloon arch drifted slightly in a draft from the hallway. Lily and Noah, picking up on something in the air that they could feel but not name, slid off their chairs and disappeared into the backyard without being asked. Smart children, both of them. Marcus's face had gone a dull, patchy red from his collar all the way to his cheekbones. "That's not a fair comparison." "I live alone," Joanne said simply. "I have for 12 years since your father left. By your logic, that makes me available." She looked at her son with the direct, unembarrassed steadiness of a woman who stopped performing patience some years ago. "So tell me, why her and not me?" Marcus turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands and said absolutely nothing. There was nothing to say that would not make it worse, and whatever else Marcus was, he was not stupid. The party ended earlier than it might have otherwise. After the gifts were opened and the plates were cleared, and Marcus had retreated to the kitchen to wash dishes with the focused intensity of a man who very much wants to be occupied. Joanne found me on the back porch. The late October air was cold and smelled of fallen leaves and wood smoke drifting from somewhere down the block. In the yard, Lily was pushing Noah on the old rope swing, and his laugh carried back to us in short, bright bursts. Joanne stood beside me and looked out at them. "I owe you an apology," she said. I turned to look at her, genuinely surprised. "You haven't done anything to me." "No." She watched Noah kick his feet high, reaching for something. "That is exactly why I owe you one." She exhaled slowly through her nose. "He did this to me first. When Marcus and Vanessa first moved in together, he started expecting the same things from me, watching the children covering costs when things were tight, being available when it was convenient for them. I said no. It took 2 arguments and 1 Thanksgiving that none of us enjoyed, but I said no and I held it. And then? I asked. Some part of me already knew. Then he stopped asking me. Her jaw tightened just slightly, a small movement controlled. About a year after I said no, I heard him on the phone with Vanessa. He was telling her that her mother might be willing to help, that you seemed like the type who wouldn't mind being asked. She paused. His exact words were, "She has no one keeping her busy. She'll come when you call." The wood smoke smell wrapped around us. Lily laughed at something Noah said from the swing. "He moved on to me," I said. "Yes." Her voice carried something that was past anger, the particular flat weight of a person who has finished grieving a thing and arrived at the cold, permanent fact of it. "And I should have called you then. I told myself it was not my place to interfere, that you were a grown woman who could make your own decisions." She looked at me directly for the first time since we had come outside, and what I saw in her eyes was not pity. It was recognition, the look of someone who has been in the same room and knows exactly what the furniture feels like. But I should have said something. I am sorry I didn't. We stood on that porch for a while, the cold deepening around us, the children's voices rising and falling in the yard. 2 women, 1 pattern, used in sequence by the same person, each of us thinking for a time that we were simply being helpful. About 3 weeks later, on a quiet weekday morning while I was getting ready for my shift, my phone rang. Marcus. His voice was softer than I had heard it in a long time. Careful, shaped, the voice of someone who has thought about what they are about to say and arranged it accordingly. "Mom," he said, "Vanessa and I have been talking. We'd like to come say sorry, properly this time." I thanked him. I said I would think about it and let them know. Then I hung up and stood in my kitchen very still, looking out at the rose bushes through the window. They were coming along. They really were coming along. But something sat in the center of my chest that I could not quite put a name to. Not hope, not suspicion exactly. Something in between, the way the sky looks in November just before you can tell whether what is coming is rain or something worse. Before I tell you what was really inside that bakery box Marcus brought home and what it was actually meant to do, type Auntie May in the comments to let me know you are still here with me. What Joanne discovered that evening will stay with you. Please note portions of this story include fictional elements added for storytelling purposes. If you prefer to step away now, that is completely okay. But for those of you staying, you will want to hear this. The rose bushes were finally starting to look like themselves again. I had spent 3 Saturday mornings out there on my knees in the dirt, cutting back the dead growth, turning the soil, pressing fresh mulch down around the base of each plant, the way Gerald used to do every November without fail. My hands had blisters in 2 new places. My lower back ached in that particular way. That means you did something that cost you something real, and I did not mind either of those things at all. The garden had been neglected for almost 3 years. Some of that neglect was grief. Some of it, I was beginning to understand, was simply that I had run out of hours that belonged to me. I was kneeling beside the 3rd bush, working a clump of compacted soil loose with my fingers, when my phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. A text from Vanessa. "Marcus wants to come Sunday. He has something he wants to say. Can we—" I sat back on my heels and read it twice. The November air was sharp and cold around me, and somewhere down the street a neighbor was burning leaves, that particular autumn smell that always reminds me of football games and hot cider and the way Ohio feels when the year is winding itself down. I thought about the phone call 3 weeks ago. Marcus's voice, soft and careful, shaped around every word like he had tried each one on before committing to it. Properly this time, he had said. I had thought about that word properly more than once since. The way it implied that there had been a first attempt. The way it left no room to ask what had gone wrong with that one. I thought about standing in my kitchen after that call, the feeling I could not name, sitting in the center of my chest, like something that had not decided yet what it was going to become. I typed back, "Sunday afternoon is fine." I put the phone in my pocket and went back to the roses. I worked for another hour until the cold got into my fingers and the light started going gray at the edges. Then I washed my hands at the outdoor tap, dried them on my jacket, and went inside to make soup. I did not sleep particularly well that Saturday night. I lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around me and thought about all the different versions of Sunday afternoon that might exist. Vanessa's face when she was genuinely sorry. Vanessa's face when she was performing sorry. I had seen both over the years. I knew the difference. I was not sure yet which one was coming. What I did not know, could not have known, was what was happening across town while I was lying there in the dark. I only found out when Joanne called me Monday morning. She told me everything in the careful, measured voice of someone who has decided that the kindest thing they can do is give you the facts and let you feel them in your own time. I will tell you what she told me, because it matters to the rest of this. Marcus came home Saturday evening carrying a white bakery box from Delaney's The Pastry Shop on 4th Street, the one I had been going to since before Vanessa was born. They make an almond Danish there that I have loved for 30 years. Flaky buttery with a thin glaze that crackles when you press your finger to it. Marcus knew that. He had remembered and he had gone out of his way to get it. Vanessa looked at that box and Joanne told me she heard this from Vanessa herself. Days later, started crying right there in the kitchen. She said she had thought maybe I was wrong about him. Maybe this is who he really is when things get hard enough. She said yes. She put her arms around him and meant it completely. That same evening, Joanne was trying to return a sweater Noah had left at her apartment after his birthday party, a gray one with a rocket ship embroidered on the chest, the one he had asked after 3 times that week. She called Marcus's cell. No answer. She called the house line. No answer. She drove past on her way home from her evening shift at the hotel laundry and saw the lights on in the kitchen. She pulled over, parked, walked up the front path and knocked twice, a solid, unhurried knock, the kind that expects an answer. No one came. She knocked again and called out, "Marcus, it's Mom. I have Noah's sweater." Still nothing. The front door was not fully closed. It had drifted inward at her second knock, and through the gap she heard her own name. Marcus, saying it clearly, casually. The way you say a name when you are certain no one outside the room can hear you. She pushed the door open and stepped into the front hallway, still holding the sweater. "Marcus, Vanessa, it's me. I can hear you in there. I have Noah's sweater." From the kitchen, Marcus's voice traveled clearly down the hall. He was not speaking loudly. He simply had not heard her come in. "Just be soft with her for a few weeks. Once she agrees to watch the kids again, everything goes back to the way it was." Joanne went completely still. Her hand tightened around Noah's folded sweater. "You really think it'll work?" Vanessa's voice, uncertain, hopeful in a way that made Joanne's stomach clench. "She's been alone in that house for 6 years," the sound of the bakery box being set down on the counter. "She's lonely, she'll come around. We just have to give her enough time to miss us and not push too hard while she does it." Joanne stood in that hallway for what she told me felt like a very long time, though she thought it was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. Long enough for the full weight of what she was hearing to settle through her. Long enough to understand that the almond Danish was not kindness. It was a tool. The apology was not remorse. It was a strategy. And her son, her own son, had learned this somewhere along the way, from watching what worked and what didn't, and had never once asked himself whether it was right. She walked down the hall. Marcus was leaning against the kitchen counter with his arms crossed, comfortable, completely at ease in the way people are at ease when they think they are alone. Vanessa was at the table with both hands wrapped around her coffee mug, her eyes soft with relief, already believing the version of the evening she had been offered. They both looked up at the same moment. What crossed Marcus's face in the 2 seconds before he could rearrange his expression was not guilt exactly. It was something colder. The look of a person who has been caught not doing something wrong because they never thought it was wrong, but doing something they knew on some level that other people would see differently. He went the color of old chalk. Vanessa's hands clenched the mug so hard her knuckles showed white through the skin. Joanne walked to the kitchen table. She laid Noah's gray sweater down, carefully smoothed it once with her palm, as if that was what she had come to do. And she had done it, and now she was finished. She straightened. "I'll let myself out," she said. "Mom." Marcus's voice. She did not stop. She told me she sat in her car in front of their house for 10 full minutes before she trusted herself to drive. Her hands were shaking against the steering wheel, not from anger, she said, but from something heavier than anger. The exhaustion of recognizing a pattern you have seen before in someone you love and knowing that you cannot interrupt it for them. You can only decide what you do with what you know. What she did was call me Monday morning. She spoke in a flat, careful voice, measuring each sentence before she released it, the way you speak when you understand that the information you are carrying belongs to someone else first. When she finished, I thanked her. There was a pause. "I thought you deserved to know before they came to your door," she said. "You were right. Thank you, Joanne." After we hung up, I sat with my coffee and looked out the kitchen window at the rose bushes. The mulch was dark and fresh against the cold ground. The canes were cut back clean. Everything in order, everything prepared, waiting. I thought about the almond Danish at Delaney's, about how well it had worked, how completely it had worked, how quickly Vanessa's chest had loosened when she saw that box. I thought about how Marcus had learned to read exactly what was needed and deploy it at exactly the right moment. I wondered when he had learned that. I wondered how many times it had worked before. I wondered if he even knew consciously that there was a difference between caring about someone and knowing how to manage them. I sat there for a long time watching the gray November light move slowly across the kitchen floor. Joanne also told me what happened in that kitchen after she walked out. Vanessa told her herself 4 days later, the way you tell someone something, when you can no longer carry it alone. She said Vanessa did not cry, did not raise her voice, did not do any of the things you might expect a person to do after the floor drops out from under them. She put her coffee mug down on the table. Very slowly. The way you set something down when your hands have stopped being reliable and you do not want to find out what happens if you test them further. And then she looked at her husband. Really looked at him. Joanne said the way you look at something you have been looking at for years and are suddenly seeing for the first time with an expression that Joanne had never seen on her daughter-in-law's face before. Not anger, not hurt. Something quieter and more lasting than either. The expression of a person who has just caught a glimpse of themselves in someone else's behavior and cannot turn away from what they recognize there. Marcus tried to explain. Joanne was already at the front door, and she did not hear what he said. But she heard Vanessa's voice, low, strange, almost like she was talking to herself. "Do you know that I don't even know what my mother likes to do on a Saturday afternoon?" The front door closed. 2 days later, a Wednesday evening near the end of November, the kind of cold, dark evening where you can see your breath inside the porch light, someone knocked on my front door. The knock was soft, almost tentative. Like whoever was standing on the other side was not entirely sure they had earned the right to be there. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and went to answer it. I opened the door. Vanessa stood on the front step in her work coat, the dark blue one with the missing button on the second eyelet that she had been meaning to fix for 2 years. I had offered to sew it back on 4 times. She always said she would get to it. The button was still missing. Some things you notice more when you have started paying attention. Her hair was still pulled back from her shift. Her eyes were red around the edges, not from crying just now, but from the kind of tired that settles deep into your face after you have been carrying something heavy for several days without putting it down. She was alone. No Lily bouncing on her heels behind her. No Noah with his jacket half-zipped. No Marcus standing one careful step back with a bakery box and a rehearsed expression. No reason I could identify. Just my daughter standing at my door in the November dark with her hands at her sides and absolutely nothing in them. In 6 years, Vanessa had never come to my door with nothing. There had always been something a child that needed dropping off a bag of things. She needed me to hold on to a question that was really a request, wearing a question's clothes. Always something, always a reason. Tonight, there was none. "Can I come in?" she asked. Her voice was careful, like she was not entirely sure of the answer. "Of course," I said. "You never have to ask." She followed me to the kitchen. I filled the kettle and set it on the burner because I did not know what else to do with my hands, and because the kitchen had always been where the two of us did our most honest talking, even when we did not mean to. When Vanessa was 16 and had her first real heartbreak, she had not come to find me in the living room. She had come and sat at this table and waited for me to notice she was there. Some rooms carry a certain kind of permission. Vanessa sat down and pulled her coat off and draped it over the back of the chair. Then she sat there looking at her own hands, pressing her thumbnail slowly into the center of her palm. She used to do that as a little girl when she was working herself up to saying something she knew was going to be hard. I had not seen her do it in 20 years. My throat tightened just looking at it. "I want to tell you that Marcus made me this way," she said finally. Her voice was steady, but only barely the way a candle flame holds steady in a room where the air has not quite stopped moving. I had the whole thing planned. I worked it out on the drive over, every sentence. I sat across from her and waited. But it wouldn't be true. Her jaw tightened and released. He encouraged it. He made it feel normal, made it easy to keep going. But I was doing this before him, Mom, before Noah, before Lily, before any of it. Her voice dropped to something lower and rougher, like gravel under something smooth. "I have been calling you my whole adult life, and I never once stopped to ask myself what it was costing you." The kettle began to hiss on the burner behind me. "I turned you into a slot on our weekly calendar." She said it like the words tasted like something spoiled. "I knew which days you were free. I knew exactly what time you could pick up Lily and what time you could get to Noah. I knew what he liked you to cook on Fridays." Her voice cracked on the last word, a clean, sharp break, and she stopped and pressed her knuckles hard against her mouth for a moment, breathing through her nose, collecting herself. "But I didn't know what you liked to do on a Saturday afternoon when we weren't calling. I didn't know what made you happy. I didn't know what you looked forward to." She looked up at me with eyes that were glassy and bright and full. I never thought to ask, not once, in 6 years. My eyes burned, my throat ached down into my chest. "Are you sorry?" I said carefully, "because things are harder now without me, or are you sorry because you hurt me?" Vanessa held my gaze. Her eyes were filling despite everything she was doing to stop at that same iron stubbornness she had inherited from Gerald, the kind that digs its heels in even when the ground is giving way. 2 tears broke loose and slid down her cheeks in quick succession, and she did not wipe them away. She let them go. "I am sorry," she said, "because I made you believe that your only value to us was being useful." Her voice broke fully on that last word, cracked all the way through. "That was never true. You are my mother, not my babysitter, not my backup plan, not the person I call when everything else falls through." She pressed her lips together. "My mother. And I treated you like something that was just always going to be there, like furniture, like the couch or the kitchen table. Something you stop seeing because it never moves and you stop thinking it needs anything." I stood up and went to the stove. I poured the tea, slowly taking my time because I needed a moment that belonged only to me before I said what I needed to say. When I sat back down, I wrapped both hands around my mug and looked at my daughter, at the woman she had grown into, at Gerald's stubbornness in her jaw and my mother's shape in her hands, and I felt something shift inside my chest, not breaking, not cracking. Something more like a house settling after a long, hard winter, finding a new position, making peace with a new shape. "I forgive you," I said. Vanessa let out a breath that trembled visibly on its way out her shoulders, dropping 2 inches. "But forgiving you," I said, "does not mean we go back to the way things were. I need you to hear that clearly." "I know." She nodded, wiping her face with the back of her wrist, not delicately the way you wipe your face when you are done being careful about how you look. "I'm not asking for that. I'm not asking you to go back." She straightened slightly in her chair. "I'm asking if there's a way to start something different, where I call to ask, not to assume, where I think about what you need, not just what I need from you, where you are a person I am in a relationship with, not a resource I draw from." She had never in her life said anything like that to me. "That is all I have ever wanted," I said. She nodded, a small nod, tired and genuine and without any performance left in it at all. Just a woman who had come to a hard place and was standing in it without trying to make it look like anything other than what it was. We drank our tea. We talked for a while, not about the past weeks, not about Marcus, not about what would happen next. We talked about Lily's Ohio History Project, which had apparently become extremely ambitious and now involved a hand-drawn map of the entire state. We talked about Noah's missing front tooth, which had finally come out on a Tuesday, and which he had immediately lost somewhere in the back seat of Marcus's car. Small things, real things. The kind of things I had been too busy managing to simply enjoy hearing about. When Vanessa left, she hugged me at the door, a real hug, both arms held for a count of several seconds. She smelled like the hand lotion she had used since college, something with lavender in it. I had not noticed that in a very long time. "Mom," she said against my shoulder, "I'm glad you didn't just let it go." "I almost did," I said honestly. She pulled back and looked at me. "I'm glad you didn't." The weeks that followed were quiet and unremarkable and exactly what I needed them to be. Marcus rearranged his delivery routes. Vanessa told me in passing one evening, "The way you mentioned something that has been handled and does not require further discussion." He had spoken to his supervisor, shifted his Tuesday and Thursday schedules, and now picked up the children himself on those days. It had involved, she said, considerable negotiation and a fair amount of complaining on his part, but he did it. I said very little in response. Some adjustments speak for themselves. I kept walking in the mornings down Birchwood Avenue and back in the cold December air with my hands in my jacket pockets and my breath making small white clouds. Dorothy and I went to garden club every other Saturday. Clara and I made our Thursday lunch at the diner on Maple, a standing appointment. Proper sit-down meals, not just coffee grabbed between tasks. I finished replanting the rose bed. I started reading again, reading a book at a time in the evenings after dinner with no phone nearby. Small things. Mine. All mine. Then on a Friday evening near the end of December, as the year was winding down toward its last few days, my phone rang. Vanessa. I picked up on the second ring. "Mom." Her voice was different. Lighter than it had been since before October. Not the careful, measured neutral she had been using since everything happened, not performed ease, but something closer to her actual voice, the one I remembered from before all of this. "Do you have plans Saturday night?" I smiled before I answered, and I did not try to stop it. "I do, actually. Dinner with Clara and Dorothy." A small pause on her end. "Good." She said it simply, without any edge to it, like she genuinely meant it. "Sunday, then, do you want to come for dinner? I don't need you to do anything. Marcus will be home. The kids want to see you." A shorter pause, and then quietly, "I just want you there." I looked at the photograph on the kitchen shelf. Gerald in the backyard the August before he got sick, squinting into the afternoon sun, with one hand raised against the glare, caught mid-laugh at something just off camera that I could no longer recall. His smile was the most familiar thing in the world to me. It had been 6 years, and it was still the most familiar thing in the world. "I want you there. Not we need you to watch the kids. Not can you bring something. Not are you free because we have a problem. Just I want you there." My daughter's voice saying those 4 words and meaning only those 4 words. "I'll be there," I said. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after I hung up. The house was warm and quiet around me. Outside the window, the rose bushes stood bare and dark in the December cold, dormant, the way roses go dormant, not gone, not finished, only resting, waiting for the right season to begin again. I had spent so many years being afraid that if I stopped making myself endlessly available, the people I loved would stop finding reasons to come back. I had confused being needed with being loved for so long that I had forgotten the two were different things entirely. Being needed keeps people close out of necessity. Being loved brings them back by choice. Vanessa called on a Sunday evening with nothing to ask for and nowhere to be. She came back by choice. Limits do not take away the people who truly love you. They only take away the right to use you. And learning the difference between those two things, learning to let one go without fearing you are losing the other, that I think is one of the harder and more important things a person can do. It took me 63 years to learn it. I do not think that is too late. If there is one thing this family drama taught me, it is this: the people who truly love you will still be there after you learn to say no. I spent 6 years disappearing, one errand at a time, one unanswered need of my own at a time. Don't be like me. Don't wait for someone to tell you to your face that you are not worth caring for before you decide that you are. I believe God puts certain moments in our lives not to break us, but to wake us up. That Tuesday evening at Vanessa's table was mine. Love that requires you to have no needs of your own is not love. It is convenience wearing love's clothing. The family drama inside our own homes is often the quietest kind. No courtrooms, no shouting. Just one person slowly fading while everyone else moves forward. These revenge stories with Mom are rarely about revenge. They are about a woman finally deciding she matters. Every family drama like this one begins with someone giving too much for too long. Every one of these revenge stories with Mom begins with one small necessary word: no, and ends with something far harder, to say the truth. If this family drama felt familiar, if these revenge stories with Mom touched something real in you, leave a comment below. Share this with someone who needs it. Subscribe so you never miss the next revenge stories with Mom on this channel. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end. The stories on this channel contain fictional elements created for reflection and connection. If this is not for you, step away freely. But if you are still here, I am truly glad.